My mom laughed, loud enough for the entire table to hear. "You'll never own a house like your sister." Cassandra smirked, leaning back in her chair. "She'll be broke forever." I didn't argue. I didn't rush to defend myself, which was my usual mistake. I just smiled. And that smile was immediately mistaken for surrender. Weeks later, both of their cars rolled up my driveway. They called, phone vibrating with a sudden, frantic urgency. I didn't answer. I stood inside the doorway of the house they swore would never be mine, and typed 4 words that ended everything. "Get off my property." But before that ending, there was the beginning. I was Kelsey, the 32-year-old creative strategist who chose color palettes over corporate hierarchies. Cassandra, my older sister by 3 years, was the polished corporate lawyer who had done life exactly as our mother had designed it. Top university, high-paying career, and a marriage that felt curated for a magazine spread. She was the one everyone pointed to when they talked about doing things right. I was the quiet one with ink smudges on my fingers from sketching late into the night. My choices: a demanding, passion-driven freelance career run from my small downtown apartment, were interpreted not as independence, but as a lack of ambition. Growing up, success wasn't just encouraged in our house, it was measured, ranked, and displayed like trophies. Cassandra's accomplishments were recited like scripture, at every family gathering: new promotion, new bonus, new luxury vacation. Our mother would beam, nodding proudly as if my sister were a perfect prototype she had personally engineered. Then there was me. I was asked about in passing, usually followed by a sigh, a raised eyebrow, or a shake of the head when I mentioned a new small business client or a branding project that excited me. "Design isn't stable, Kelsey," my mother would lecture. "When are you going to choose a career that respects your potential?" I worked full-time at a creative studio. But my real life began after 5 in the afternoon, fueled by coffee and the belief that I could shape my own foundation. I wasn't rich, I wasn't flashy, but I was building something real, client by client, project by project. I kept trying to stay connected. Hoping one day they would see me for more than the gaps between their expectations and my choices. Then came that Thanksgiving dinner. The air in the expensive suburban dining room was heavy with the smell of roasting herbs and the distinct, subtle aroma of judgment. I had mentioned I'd repainted my apartment a deep, restful blue. Someone had complimented the small improvement. That's when the laughter started. My mother's laugh was sharp, cutting through the general buzz of conversation like broken glass. It was amused, genuinely tickled that I would even mention a rental apartment update as a sign of progress. It was a punchline. I felt my cheeks flush, that familiar, tight heat of humiliation spreading across my face. Cassandra, seated across the table, lifted her wine glass slowly. She had that familiar, condescending smirk. The one that had followed me since childhood, reminding me of my designated place in the family hierarchy. Always a step below her, always struggling for validation. "It's just a rental, Mom," Cassandra said, her voice light, almost amused, making my repaint sound like a pathetic attempt at adulthood. She turned her focus to me. "You'll never own a house like your sister." And then, to seal the verdict, she added the crushing sentence: "She'll be broke forever." In the past, I would have immediately launched into a defense, explaining my aggressive saving strategy, listing my successful clients, justifying my choice of freedom over stability. I would have tried desperately to prove them wrong right there, begging for a scrap of respect. But that night, the insults hit differently. For the first time, I felt something in me settle instead of stir. The sting wasn't as sharp. The urge to explain why my creative path mattered vanished. Instead, I felt a strange, steady quietness because somewhere deep inside, something had already flipped. I let the flush fade. I lowered my gaze, then lifted it again, meeting Cassandra's eye not with heat, but with a cold, almost detached clarity. I didn't say a single word. I just smiled. It wasn't a happy smile. But it was a true one. A smile of perfect self-possession. They mistook that quiet smile for me finally giving up, for me admitting they were right. They thought they had won. I drove back to my small apartment in the city with the cold settling into my bones. A cold I couldn't shake. The highway lights blurred through my windshield, reminding me of how small they believed my world was. Cassandra's words, "I'd be broke forever," replayed in my mind. It wasn't just an insult. It was a verdict they assumed they had the authority to hand down. But somewhere between the highway exit and the narrow street that led to my building, that clarity solidified into an iron resolve. I pulled into my usual parking spot and sat there for a long moment, realizing I wasn't hurt or humiliated anymore. The metal of the hood felt cool beneath my hand, but inside my chest, the cold, quiet fire was just beginning to roar. I was simply, profoundly, done. I was done trying to fit into a mold that had been crushing me for so long. I walked upstairs, unlocked my door, and stood in the middle of my tiny living room. Staring at the scattered sketches, the color swatches pinned above my desk, the logos drying on my table. It wasn't much, but it was all mine. Every client I had earned. Every late night that shaped the foundation of something real, all of it belonged to me. Suddenly, their opinions, their predictions, their certainty about my failure felt insignificant. They were smaller than the paint stains on my jeans, smaller than the chipped coffee mug on my counter. For the first time in my life, their words had no power to dictate my worth. The only thing that mattered now was the quiet, monumental work I was about to begin. The next morning, the sting of their words fueled a silent revolution in my tiny downtown apartment. I woke up before my alarm, not out of anxiety like in years past, but out of a cold, clear purpose. The previous night's humiliation had washed away, leaving behind a hard, crystalline resolve. I opened my laptop. I looked at the backlog of freelance inquiries I had been half ignoring, and started answering every single one. No more deferring the hard conversations. No more undercharging to avoid confrontation. I realized their verdict of broke forever wasn't a curse, it was a challenge. And the only way to meet it was with absolute, unyielding professionalism. My first act of rebellion was raising my rates. Dramatically. I had spent being the easy, inexpensive option. The kind of designer who was grateful for the work. Now I was going to be the premium option. The one who knew her worth was tied to her results, not her fear of being rejected. I rewrote my portfolio, focusing only on the high, impact branding projects I loved, the ones that paid well and stretched my creativity. I organized my projects, implementing a schedule that was almost military in its precision. I knew that stability wasn't found in a 9-to-5 corporate job. It was built on structure and scalability. This wasn't about proving them wrong in an angry way. That would have been too easy, too exhausting, and ultimately still reliant on their attention. This was about building something so stable, so fundamentally successful, that their opinions would eventually become irrelevant, background noise. During those early weeks, the transformation was quiet, but palpable. I would work my full-time studio hours, then brew a pot of industrial, strength coffee, and dive straight into my freelance work. I partnered with small businesses that trusted my vision completely, and startups that needed someone who understood how design could truly shift perception and identity. I didn't just push pixels, I pushed for results. One day, I took a consultation call for a large, multi-phase renovation project, not my usual type of work, but intriguing. It was for a friend of a friend who needed an initial strategy and branding for a historic restoration effort. The contractor on the line, Marcus Harris, was all business. His voice was precise, his questions technical and sharp. I had to scramble a little to keep up with his exacting standards. "Look, Kelsey," he said. his tone neutral. This is a high-cost, high-visibility project. We need a brand that signals quality, not just creativity. I understand, I replied, feeling a small surge of respect for his directness. My strategy isn't about being flashy. It's about being foundational. We brand the structure, not the trends. I didn't get that specific contract, but Marcus's demanding precision stuck with me. He was someone who built things to last, and I liked that. I realized I was striving to become exactly that kind of person in my own field. Around the family, I began implementing what I called the quiet distance. I stopped volunteering information they never valued. The short, clipped messages from my mother in the family group chat, usually asking if I'd applied for a new, stable job, sat unanswered until I felt like responding. Cassandra continued posting her perfectly curated life, online exotic vacations, designer handbags, new furniture. My mother would repost every highlight with her usual pride. But none of it touched me anymore. I had erected an invisible shield of indifference. The shift was profound. It wasn't spite, but distance, a clean, quiet distance. I stopped needing to defend my creative choices to them. I was too busy making those choices profitable. Within months, my client list doubled, then tripled. Payments came in steadily. I saved aggressively, funneling every spare dollar into a high-yield account. I learned rapidly, managing budgets and legal contracts as fiercely as I managed color palettes. One evening, I wrapped up a complex branding project that paid more in a single week than my studio salary did in an entire month. I leaned back in my chair, the city quiet outside my window, and felt a stillness settle over me. A profound, unwavering knowing. I hadn't argued at the dinner table. I hadn't defended myself. I had simply smiled. They still had no idea what I was building, and I wasn't going to tell them until it was already mine. The quiet months of building led to a moment I hadn't prepared for: the cold, objective validation of a stranger. It happened on a quiet Tuesday afternoon in the middle of a project sprint. I was reviewing my quarterly numbers with Mr. Chen, my accountant, a man whose sole concern was logic and finance, entirely removed from my family's emotional drama. I was distracted, checking email replies on my second monitor, when Mr. Chen, after reviewing my profit and loss statements, paused long enough for me to look up. He adjusted his silver-framed glasses, his expression one of slight, detached surprise. "Kelsey," he said, using my name with a seriousness I hadn't heard from him before, "you might want to start thinking about long-term investments. You're sitting on more cash than you realize." The line itself was simple, almost bureaucratic, but it landed with the force of a physical blow. It stunned me. Not because I didn't believe in my work, but because no one who had an emotional stake in my life, not my mother, not Cassandra, not even my father, had ever spoken to me like I was someone capable of building something substantial, something real. The word, cash, was tangible. The phrase, long-term investments, felt like permission. I hadn't known until that moment how desperately I'd needed an objective third party to confirm that I was capable, that I was not, in fact, broke forever. It was the external proof I needed to silence the old voices in my head. I spent the rest of the day in a blur of focused work. But the accountant's words kept circling. That evening, after sending off the final files to a client, I sat on the floor of my apartment. The evening air was cool, scented faintly by the city and the potted herbs on my windowsill. I looked around the space that had been my safe haven for years. The tiny living room, cluttered with color palettes and sketchbooks, felt suddenly too compressed. It wasn't that I felt resentful of the small space. It was that I had finally outgrown the mental limitations that came with it. I was finally ready to let myself want more, not their version of more, but as mine. Their version of success was glossy and new, a suburban blueprint condo where everything matched. My version was rooted in history, authenticity, and the messy, challenging process of restoration. I opened my laptop and started searching listings with no particular expectation. I scrolled past the modern, cookie-cutter condos that all looked the same. The kind of place Cassandra would buy. My finger paused when a headline caught my eye. Historic Victorian home in Milbrook. Milbrook. That neighborhood was a physical symbol of everything I had been mocked for not achieving. Our mother used to drive us through Milbrook, just to point out which grand homes belonged to real successes. It was meant to motivate Cassandra and demoralize me. I clicked the listing. The photo showed a tall, imposing house with a wraparound porch, massive windows, and a turret that looked like it was spun from light. The description detailed original woodwork that needed restoration and stained glass windows that promised jewel-toned mornings. It looked like a story waiting to be rewritten, a house that demanded passion and hard work, not just a hefty down payment. It felt like it was waiting for me. My heart hammered in my chest. This wasn't just a financial transaction. It was a confrontation with my past, executed entirely on my own terms. If I bought this house, I would be symbolically claiming the status they always denied me, but doing it through effort and vision, not conformity. The next morning, I contacted the listing agent. I didn't waste time on second thoughts. I knew exactly what I was looking for: a future that couldn't be judged by their outdated metrics. I was done proving myself to the world. I was ready to build a world for myself. I typed Milbrook Victorian into the search bar. A neighborhood my mother had weaponized for years, and found the turreted home that felt like destiny. The next morning, I reached out, and that is how I met Eleanor Vance, the listing agent. Eleanor was a woman in her late 50s, wearing a perfectly tailored, sharp blazer, but with eyes that were unexpectedly kind and patient. She didn't look me up and down the way so many adults in my family circle had, calculating my worth based on my shoes or my handbag. She didn't ask if I had a co-signer or question the source of my funds. She just sat across the table, placed her hands neatly on the mahogany, and asked, "What are you looking for in a home?" "Kelsey." I told her the truth, the raw, emotional truth that I usually kept locked away. "Something with history," I explained. "Something that demands work. Not just money. Something that feels like it waited for me." Eleanor studied me for a long moment, a subtle smile touching the corners of her lips. "Then I think you should see it in person," she said. She understood. Walking through that house for the first time was like stepping into the version of life I had quietly been building for myself, without even fully realizing the final structure. The floors creaked with age, telling stories only time could write. The original stained glass windows scattered brilliant, jewel-toned colors across the polished walls. The circular turret room, bathed in sunlight, felt instantly like the perfect office, a space where ideas would breathe better than they ever could in my small downtown flat. The house needed work, a lot of it. It needed updating, repairing, and honoring. But I wasn't intimidated by the sheer scale of the project. I felt ready. I felt like the house and I were mutually choosing each other for a long-term partnership. The purchase process was fast and quiet. The previous owner, Mrs. Adelaide Hart Wyatt, was a graceful woman who had lived in the house for over 50 years and was emotionally invested in its future. When we met, she asked me only one question that mirrored Eleanor's. "Will you love it, Kelsey? Truly love it?" I didn't hesitate. "Yes," I said, meaning every single syllable. When I meant it, something in her softened, and she nodded her approval. 2 weeks later, after all the inspections, negotiations, and signatures, I held the heavy brass keys in my hand. I didn't tell my family. I didn't need their approval, or their commentary contaminating something that finally felt pure and hard-earned. The achievement was mine, and the victory was silent. The next critical step was the renovation. and I knew I couldn't handle the historic structure alone. I needed a contractor who respected the bones of the house as much as I did. I remembered Marcus Harris, the sharp, technically brilliant man I had consulted with months earlier. His meticulous nature, which I initially found intimidating, now felt essential. I called him, and to my surprise, he remembered the details of my brief consultation instantly. I outlined the massive scope of the Victorian project, the structural repairs, the delicate woodwork, the turret restoration. "That's serious work, Kelsey," Marcus said, his voice flat and professional. "You need someone who doesn't cut corners." "I know," I replied. "That's why I'm calling you." He paused for a beat. "All right. Send me the plans." Hiring Marcus solidified the feeling that this house was a commitment to quality in every sense. He represented the demanding, high-standard professional world that my mother valued, but he operated with the honesty and technical skill that she never saw in my creative field. I secured the house using my freelance income, fulfilling the prophecy of ownership exactly on my own terms. The Milbrook Victorian wasn't a trophy for my family's mantle. It was the foundation of my own independence, and the building process began immediately. The Victorian became my silence, my greatest secret. With every wall we opened, I felt like I was opening up a part of myself I'd kept boarded up for years. The renovation process was intense, demanding every spare hour of my time, but it was profoundly healing. My days were a complex balancing act: 8 hours of focused, deadline-driven design strategy for my high-paying clients, followed by another 8 hours on site, making decisions on restoration techniques, choosing paint colors that honored the home's original character, and selecting light fixtures that gave the 100-year-old house a modern pulse without sacrificing its history. Marcus Harris, my contractor, was exactly what I needed. He was relentless about quality. There was no room for error, no tolerance for the easy fix. We spent hours in the turret room, discussing the precise angle needed to restore the original arched windows, or debating the correct sealant for the antique oak flooring. Initially, our relationship was purely professional, fueled by mutual respect for craft. Marcus, with his quiet intensity, kept his emotional distance. But working shoulder to shoulder on something so personal, something that literally represented the foundation of my new life, began to erode the boundaries we both maintained. One cold afternoon, we were chipping away at decades of paint from a piece of original trim. Marcus paused, his protective gloves dusty with fine powder. "I used to be like you," he admitted, his voice low. "Building things, thinking if I made them strong enough, nothing could touch them. I built a huge contracting firm 5 years ago. Lost the whole thing on one bad partner deal. Learned the hard way that structure needs trust to stand up." It was a small admission, but for Marcus, it was monumental. He, too, had been judged for a professional failure, forced to rebuild from the ground up. His honesty created a reciprocal vulnerability I hadn't anticipated. For the first time, I shared the emotional core of my drive, telling him about the Thanksgiving dinner, about my mother's laughter and Cassandra's cold, definitive verdict. "You'll be broke forever." I told him how my smile, mistaken for surrender, had been the start of the quiet campaign that led me to this house. Marcus didn't offer sympathy. He offered clarity. "They were trying to use money to define your worth," he said, sanding vigorously. "But you're using your worth to define the money. The difference is everything." Working with him forced me to confront my fear of vulnerability. I had spent years being independent to the point of isolation, believing that accepting help was a weakness that my family would exploit. But with Marcus, accepting his expert guidance, trusting him with the structural integrity of the house, felt like a strength. It was the first true act of allowing someone else behind my carefully constructed walls. With every tile I chose, every wall we repaired, every room I reclaimed, I felt my life expanding. This was the beginning of my pushback, not through verbal confrontation, but through deliberate, steady creation. The renovation wasn't just about fixing a house, it was about repairing my emotional foundation. Finally, the renovations wrapped on a breezy Saturday morning. The air felt lighter, as if the house itself were finally exhaling after months of being touched, repaired, and restored. I walked through each room barefoot. The floors warm under the morning light. The kitchen smelled faintly of new paint. The turret room glowed with a soft, promising sun, and the stained glass scattered colors across the halls like quiet promises. I moved in quietly. No fanfare, no social media announcement, no telling the family. Just me. My boxes, and a home that felt like it finally understood the parts of me that had always been overlooked. I placed my sketchbooks on the built-in shelves, hung my favorite prints above the mantel, and stood on the wraparound porch until the sky melted into dusk. I was fully settled. Not finished, just settled. I had built a life they said I'd never have, and I had done it on my own terms. The quiet was perfect. But I knew it wouldn't last. Thought the silence was the end of the story. I was wrong. 2 weeks after I settled into the comfort of the restored Victorian, the phone calls started, pulling me back to the narrative I thought I'd finally escaped. It began subtly. A vague text from a cousin asking if I was doing something different. Then, the first call came from my mother. Her voice, usually sharp and authoritative, hovered between suspicion and outright disbelief. "Kelsey, your sister said you've been telling people you bought a house in Milbrook. Is that true?" There it was. Not curiosity, not pride, not even mild interest. Just accusation, instantly assuming the worst. That I was either lying or showing off. "It's true," I confirmed simply. A long, heavy silence stretched across the line, stunned and disbelieving. The idea that I, the creative disappointment, could afford a historic property in the very neighborhood she used as a benchmark for success seemed to short-circuit her understanding of reality. Finally, she exhaled, a sharp ragged sound. "Impossible. Where in Milbrook, Kelsey? Give me the address." Then, as if remembering she was speaking to the daughter she was supposedly concerned about, she delivered the command. "Send the address. We're coming to see it." I almost laughed. After years of belittling my work, dismissing my choices, and questioning my fundamental worth, she said it like it was her right. Like she was entitled to walk through something she never believed I could build. She was demanding entry to my victory. For reasons I still can't fully explain, I gave her the address. Maybe it was curiosity, wanting to see the look on her face when she saw the truth. Maybe it was the need for final closure. I wanted them to see, not for validation, but for truth. The undeniable truth of who I had become without them. I didn't prepare anything for their visit. No explanation, no document. For the first time in my life, I felt no urge to justify myself or my finances. An hour later, while I was sitting in the turret room, sorting through color samples for a new client project, my phone lit up. Then again. Call after call from my mother. Another from Cassandra. A text from both of them, then more. I let the phone vibrate quietly on the desk. I didn't answer. I didn't want the noise of their panic to invade my space. I walked downstairs, the soft, familiar creak of the hallway floors comforting under my bare feet, and stepped into the front room. Through the delicate patterns of the stained glass window, I caught movement. A dark sedan pulling up to the bottom of the long, oak-lined driveway. Doors slammed. Voices overlapped. They were here. I stood by the large, original wooden doorway as their shadows crossed the wide wraparound porch. Cassandra knocked first. Quick, impatient, and demanding. "Kelsey, open the door." Another knock, heavier this time. My mother's voice, raised and snapping, followed. "Kelsey, stop acting ridiculous. We're here. Let us in." They weren't asking, they were commanding, exactly the way they always had. They expected my immediate compliance. My lifelong training as the compliant, yearning for approval daughter to kick in. I didn't move. I didn't speak. I just watched their silhouettes shift behind the patterned glass. My phone lit up again, a constant, irritating reminder of the decades I had spent trying to earn their basic respect. As the porch filled with their rising frustration, I walked slowly to the window at the far end of the hallway. From there, I could see the full curve of the driveway and their expensive sedan sitting at the bottom of it. Like an unwanted echo from a past life. They stepped off the porch, pacing the gravel, calling my name again. The impatience was twisting into something almost frantic. It struck me how surreal the scene was. These were the same people who once laughed across a dinner table that I'd never have a home of my own. They were now standing on the property they declared would be eternally out of my reach, demanding access to a life they refused to acknowledge I had the power to build. I could feel the urgency radiating off them, not because they cared about me, but because they couldn't comprehend a version of my life that didn't orbit their expectations. Their need to control the narrative was suffocating the air around my house. I just had to cut the cord. Their voices, once capable of shattering my confidence, became a distant echo on my own front porch. The ringing vibrated through the quiet foyer, but I no longer felt the urge to prove I was worthy. I had nothing left to say to them. Because the house itself was the answer. I watched through the window as they began pacing the driveway. Cassandra called again. The ringing stopped, followed by a sharp text coming through. Kelsey, this is childish. Just open the door. We drove 40 miles to be here. Her tone was trained to sound superior, annoyed by my inconvenience. For years, that tone would have sent me spiraling, scrambling to prove I wasn't being ridiculous, scrambling to earn a minute of their time and attention. But standing there, surrounded by walls I had chosen, floors I had refinished, and a space I had claimed, something clicked into perfect, unwavering alignment. I was in my own castle. They were petitioners on the gravel outside. I picked up my phone. I didn't open the group chat. I opened a new message thread directly to my mother. Then, I forwarded the same message to Cassandra. I typed slowly, deliberately, not in anger, but with the cold, precise finality of a court order. I typed the 4 words that had waited since that quiet smile months ago. I typed, "Get off my property." The moment I hit send, I watched them both look down at their phones almost in unison. The silence that followed was instant, absolute. First, there was confusion. They exchanged a puzzled glance, probably assuming the message was a mistake or some kind of poorly executed joke. Then came the shock, as they reread the line and processed the finality of the words. Finally, their expressions twisted into something like disbelief and profound, silent defeat. They slowly lifted their eyes back toward the house. I stepped deeper into the hallway, letting the shadows swallow me, so they couldn't see me clearly through the stained glass. I didn't want them to see the small, calm smile that was forming on my lips. It was the same smile from the Thanksgiving table, but now it was loud. They didn't knock again. They didn't call my name. They just stood there for a long moment, staring at the historic house they once said I'd never own, trying to make sense of a boundary I had every right to draw. They were attempting to process a version of me that was utterly, completely independent of their judgment. Finally, Cassandra turned first. Her posture was rigid, her defeat masked by stiff, corporate pride. My mother hesitated longer. She glanced back at the porch, then at the front door, as if waiting for me to suddenly rush out, begging them to stay, apologizing for the boundary. I didn't move. I gave them nothing. They walked slowly, deliberately, toward the sedan. The engine started. The gravel crunched loudly under their tires as they backed out of the long driveway, and with each slow turn of the wheels, A weight I hadn't fully realized I was carrying. The weight of their expectations, their pressure, their control, slipped away. They weren't gone forever. But their power over my life was. The conflict that had defined my adulthood was resolved with 4 words. I stood alone in the foyer, the afternoon light shifting across the floorboards. The house settled around me with small, gentle pops and creaks. The silence wasn't empty. It was full. Full of the person I had become. Full of the future I had built with my own hands. Full of the peace that comes when you stop asking people to treat you better. And instead, you simply walk into the life where you're already enough. The silence that followed was not empty. It was a clearing. The weight I had carried for 32 years, every criticism, every dismissal, had slipped away with the gravel under their tires. That was the day the past finally ended, and the day my life truly began. I felt a sense of profound peace, a feeling that my home was not just an asset, but a protector. In the days after they left my driveway, the immediate silence from my family felt different. It was less like an absence and more like space. The kind I'd never been allowed to claim before. There were no demands, no comparisons, and no sudden reminders of where they thought I ranked in the family hierarchy. A week later, an email arrived from Cassandra. It wasn't defensive, nor was it coded in her usual professional superiority. It was just human. She wrote that watching me quietly build something substantial on my own terms, and then seeing the decisive boundary I drew at the driveway, forced her to confront the hollow emptiness of the life she performed for our mother's approval. She admitted that the things she had repeated all her life, the judgments, the insults, were not confidence, but insecurity. My independent success had shattered her designated role as the flawless golden child, and for the first time, she saw her own life not as a triumph, but as a cage of high expectations. My mother's message came later. It was shorter, shakier, sent late one night. She didn't try to justify anything she had done. She didn't defend her laughter or her pressure. She only said she was trying to understand how her version of love had turned into a crushing weight, heavy enough to push me completely away. I didn't rush to answer either one. Healing doesn't sprint, it walks. I allowed myself to feel the complexity of their messages, the relief of their honesty, mixed with the residual pain of their past cruelty. I was responding now from a home that held me, from a life I had shaped without their permission. I didn't need their validation to be real, but I could now, finally, afford their honesty. I sat in my turret office, the sunset painting the walls in deep reds and golds. I drafted my replies slowly. I didn't promise closeness or a return to the old, painful status quo. I promised honesty and boundaries. I told Cassandra I respected her desire for change. I told my mother I needed time, but that I wanted her to stop measuring my life by her fear. And that was enough to start something new. The boundaries weren't walls built in anger. They were doors I had learned to guard. They were the foundation of a potential, healthier relationship, built on mutual respect instead of obligation and fear. I had built a life they said I'd never have, and I did it on my own terms. The Milbrook Victorian stood as a monument to quiet determination, a solid, beautiful argument that had finally silenced the verdict of my past. I realized that my journey wasn't about proving them wrong. It was about finally proving myself right.